They handed over a check worth more than the entire history of women's basketball combined. Then they turned around and told the woman responsible for that check that she wasn't good enough to represent her country. Think about that for a second. Executives from one of the biggest networks on the planet walked into a negotiation room, analyzed years of data, studied every ratings spike, every sold-out arena, every viral moment, and they came to one conclusion. One player was worth betting billions on. One player had transformed a league that struggled for attention into must-watch television. One player had done what decades of marketing campaigns couldn't accomplish. And then, the people running the show looked at that same player and said thanks, but no thanks. What I'm about to break down isn't just another sports controversy. This is a story about power, about ego, about an establishment so threatened by change that they were willing to sabotage their own golden era just to prove a point. The money has already exposed the truth. The comments have revealed the motives. And by the time you understand the full timeline, you'll see why millions of fans are using one word to describe what happened: sabotage. Before we get to the billions and the betrayal, you need to understand something fundamental. Caitlin Clark didn't just enter women's basketball. She detonated a bomb in the middle of it and rebuilt the entire landscape from the crater. Her college career at Iowa wasn't just successful, it was historically unprecedented. She shattered scoring records that had stood for decades. She filled arenas that had never seen capacity crowds for women's games. She turned March Madness into appointment viewing for millions of people who had never watched a single women's basketball game in their lives. And here's the part that made certain people very uncomfortable. She did it all with a style that demanded attention. The deep three-pointers from the logo, the no-look passes that left defenders frozen, the confidence, some called it swagger, that made her impossible to ignore. She wasn't asking for permission to become a star. She was simply becoming one, whether the establishment liked it or not. When she entered the WNBA draft, the anticipation reached levels the league had never experienced. The Indiana Fever, a franchise that had struggled with attendance for years, suddenly couldn't print tickets fast enough. Season ticket requests exploded. Corporate sponsors came calling with offers that dwarfed anything previously seen in women's professional basketball. Her rookie season delivered exactly what everyone expected, and somehow even more. Games featuring Clark averaged over 1 million viewers, numbers that would have seemed like fantasy just 2 years earlier. Single matchups drew audiences exceeding 2 million, putting her broadcasts in competition with established men's sports programming. Social media engagement around her games surpassed the combined totals of multiple other franchises. The merchandise numbers told an even more dramatic story. Her jersey became the best-selling item in WNBA history within weeks. Retailers couldn't keep inventory stocked. The league's official shop crashed repeatedly under the traffic surge whenever new Clark items dropped. But here's where the tension started building beneath the surface. Women's basketball has operated under an unspoken code for decades. You come in humble. You pay respect to the veterans who kept the league alive during the lean years. You wait your turn, earn your stripes, and eventually, maybe, you get your moment in the spotlight. That's how it's always worked. That's how the hierarchy maintained itself. Caitlin Clark walked through the door and flipped that entire table over. She arrived with a Nike endorsement reportedly worth more than most veterans make in their entire careers. She had private security at games. Magazine covers featured her face before she played a single professional minute. Arenas chanted her name during warm-ups. The attention wasn't gradual. It was immediate, overwhelming, and impossible to control. Now, let me be clear about something important. The veterans of this league deserve enormous respect. These are women who sacrificed everything to keep women's basketball breathing when nobody was paying attention. They flew overseas to play in half-empty gyms for paychecks that wouldn't cover rent in most American cities. They endured conditions that would make most athletes quit on the spot. Their frustration at watching a rookie receive treatment they never experienced is completely understandable. But there's a difference between understandable frustration and institutional resistance. Instead of recognizing that Clark's rising tide could lift every boat in the harbor, certain figures in leadership positions made a different calculation. They saw her popularity not as an opportunity, but as a threat. They viewed her fans not as welcome additions, but as invaders who didn't understand the game they claimed to love. They looked at the transformation happening before their eyes and decided that protecting the old hierarchy mattered more than embracing the new reality. The whispers started almost immediately. Comments about her needing to be humbled, suggestions that the media attention was unearned, subtle jabs about fans who didn't appreciate the veterans who built the foundation she was standing on. One name kept appearing at the center of these conversations: Coach Cheryl Reeve, head coach of the Minnesota Lynx and the person responsible for selecting Team USA's Olympic roster. Her public comments carried an edge that was hard to miss. When reporters asked about the Clark phenomenon, her responses felt measured in a way that suggested calculation rather than genuine assessment. She talked about experience. She emphasized defensive capabilities. She referenced players who had proven themselves on the international stage, and between every line, a message was forming. This rookie, no matter how spectacular, needed to wait her turn. What Reeve didn't anticipate was the storm building on the horizon, because while she focused on hierarchy and tradition, something massive was happening behind closed doors. Television executives were running projections. Corporate boards were approving investments. And a deal was being constructed that would expose just how catastrophically wrong this approach truly was. The selection that shocked the world wasn't just a basketball decision. It was a declaration of war against the future. And the future was about to fight back with the most powerful weapon available: cold, hard, undeniable cash. The announcement came down like a hammer. Team USA's roster for the Paris Olympics was finalized, and Caitlin Clark's name was nowhere to be found. For a moment, people thought it was a mistake. Surely there had been some error, some miscommunication. The most talked about basketball player on the planet, the woman filling arenas and crashing broadcast servers, the rookie whose games drew more viewers than playoff matchups, she couldn't actually be excluded. That would be insane. But it wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. A deliberate, calculated, fully intentional decision made by Coach Cheryl Reeve and the selection committee. The official explanation came wrapped in reasonable-sounding language. Clark was a rookie still adjusting to the professional game. Her defensive abilities needed development. The Olympic roster required experienced players who had performed on the international stage. These weren't emotional arguments. They were basketball justifications designed to deflect criticism. And on paper, they almost made sense. Almost. Because here's what the official explanation conveniently ignored. The Olympics weren't just another tournament. They represented the single biggest global platform for women's basketball. Billions of viewers worldwide, unprecedented media exposure, a chance to convert casual observers into dedicated fans across dozens of countries. This was the moment to showcase everything the sport had to offer. And the person most capable of capturing attention, of making highlight reels that would spread across every social media platform on Earth, of giving casual viewers a reason to care about women's basketball beyond the 2 weeks of Olympic competition. She was being told to stay home. The backlash was immediate and intense. Social media erupted with fury that caught even seasoned observers off guard. This wasn't just disappointment from hardcore fans. This was outrage from millions of people who had just discovered women's basketball through Clark's games. People who had bought their first WNBA tickets specifically to watch her play. People who had never cared about the sport before, but now found themselves emotionally invested. They weren't just questioning the decision. They were demanding explanations that went beyond basketball platitudes. Reports began emerging about what happened inside the selection meetings. According to sources close to the process, Clark's name generated more debate than any other candidate. There were voices advocating for her inclusion, pointing to the marketing opportunity, the viewership potential, the chance to accelerate the growth trajectory the league was experiencing. But those voices were apparently overruled by a faction committed to traditional selection criteria. The message from leadership was clear. Popularity doesn't earn you a roster spot. Television ratings don't matter inside the lines. This team would be selected based on basketball merit as they defined it, and anyone who disagreed simply didn't understand the game. But here's where the timeline gets truly interesting. The Olympic roster announcement came just weeks before NBC finalized its historic media rights deal with the WNBA. Negotiations had been ongoing for months. Network executives had been analyzing viewership data obsessively, trying to determine exactly how much the league was worth. They had access to every rating, every demographic breakdown, every piece of evidence showing which players drove audience interest. Those executives knew something that the selection committee either ignored or didn't care about. The value they were preparing to pay for wasn't based on championship pedigree or defensive statistics. It was based almost entirely on one factor: Caitlin Clark's ability to attract eyeballs. The timing creates questions that nobody in leadership wants to answer. Did the selection committee know about the impending media deal? Were they aware of how much money was about to flow into the league specifically because of Clark's impact? Did they understand that their roster decision might directly contradict the business assumptions upon which billions of dollars were being committed? If they knew, then the exclusion looks even more reckless. If they didn't know, then the communication breakdown within women's basketball leadership was catastrophic. Either way, the optics were devastating. Because while Coach Reeve was explaining why Clark hadn't earned her spot, network executives were preparing to announce a deal that proved her value beyond any statistical argument. While the selection committee emphasized defensive capabilities and international experience, corporations were betting generational wealth on Clark's ability to transform the sport. The disconnect wasn't subtle. It was a canyon, and fans weren't the only ones who noticed. Inside NBC's offices, sources report that the roster announcement created genuine concern. Executives who had championed the WNBA investment started asking uncomfortable questions. They had just committed to paying premium prices for a product, and now the people running that product were benching its most valuable component on the world's biggest stage. The deal was already signed. The money was committed, but confidence in the league's leadership took a significant hit that day. Some people started wondering whether this was even about basketball anymore. The selection criteria didn't add up. The timing seemed almost intentional. And the comments that would follow from Coach Reeve herself would make everything look far more personal than professional. What was really happening behind those closed doors? The answer would become clearer with every statement Reeve made, and each statement dug the hole a little deeper. Let's talk about what NBC actually bought, because when you understand the math behind this deal, everything else comes into focus. The reported figures are staggering. 11 years, over $2 billion. This wasn't an incremental increase from previous media contracts. This was a complete transformation of women's basketball's financial landscape. The kind of money that changes everything. Salary caps, franchise valuations, player endorsements. The entire economic foundation of the league was being rebuilt overnight. But NBC didn't write that check based on hope or goodwill. Networks don't operate on emotion. They operate on data, projections, and calculated bets about future returns. Every dollar committed had to be justified by evidence suggesting the investment would pay off. So what did that evidence show? According to sources familiar with the negotiations, NBC's analysts conducted exhaustive research into WNBA viewership patterns. They studied years of data, looking for trends, identifying what drove audience engagement, determining which variables most strongly predicted ratings success. The findings were unmistakable. Viewership spikes didn't correlate primarily with playoff games. They didn't correlate with championship matchups featuring dynasty teams. They didn't even correlate with historic performances by established superstars. The single strongest predictor of ratings success was whether Caitlin Clark was playing. Games featuring Clark averaged viewership numbers that dwarfed everything else the league produced. Her matchups against other popular teams drew audiences competitive with established men's professional sports. When she played, casual fans tuned in. When she didn't, they found something else to watch. NBC's projections reportedly estimated that Clark-featured broadcasts would continue delivering these elevated numbers throughout the duration of the contract. They calculated merchandise revenue increases. They modeled attendance growth at arenas. They projected social media engagement metrics that would make their digital platforms more attractive to advertisers. And here's the critical detail that makes the Olympic snub look so damaging. NBC specifically factored Olympic exposure into their valuation. The Paris Games represented a massive opportunity to introduce Caitlin Clark to global audiences who had never watched the WNBA. Billions of viewers worldwide tuning in to watch basketball. A chance to create highlight moments that would spread across international media. The opportunity to convert casual Olympic viewers into dedicated WNBA fans who would drive ratings for years to come. Their projections reportedly estimated that Olympic participation could accelerate Clark's global brand recognition by several 100%. This wasn't just about 2 weeks of tournament basketball. It was about establishing a worldwide star who would anchor the league's international growth strategy. NBC was betting billions on that outcome. Then Coach Reeve said no. Consider the position this created. A network had just committed generational wealth based on specific assumptions about how the league would maximize its most valuable asset. Those assumptions included showcasing that asset on the biggest possible stage. And immediately after the ink dried, the people running women's basketball announced they would do the opposite. Sources inside NBC described the reaction as deeply concerned. Executives who had championed the WNBA deal suddenly found themselves answering difficult questions from superiors. Had they overpaid? Had they misunderstood the league's priorities? Was leadership going to make decisions that actively undermined the investment thesis? The public statements from NBC were measured and diplomatic. Corporations don't publicly attack their business partners. But privately, the conversations were reportedly far more pointed. What made matters worse was the contrast that played out during the actual Olympics. While Team USA competed in Paris, viewership numbers for women's basketball were solid but unspectacular. The games drew respectable audiences by historical standards. But they didn't deliver the breakthrough ratings that the moment seemed to promise. Meanwhile, back in the United States, Caitlin Clark participated in WNBA All-Star festivities. And those events shattered records. Viewership exploded. Social media engagement went through the roof. The player who wasn't good enough for the Olympic roster proved once again that she was the single most valuable property in women's basketball. The comparison was unavoidable and brutal. NBC had paid for a product built around Caitlin Clark's star power. Team USA delivered a product that deliberately excluded her. And the ratings told the story more clearly than any press release could. This wasn't abstract criticism about philosophical differences in player selection. This was cold financial reality. The network had bet billions on one vision of women's basketball's future. The selection committee had endorsed a completely different vision. And only one of those visions was supported by evidence. The money exposed everything. It revealed that the Olympic snub wasn't just a questionable basketball decision. It was a direct contradiction of the business model that was supposed to fund the league's growth for the next decade. When corporate partners start questioning whether leadership understands basic value propositions, problems emerge. When those questions involve billions of dollars, the problems become existential. Coach Reeve had positioned herself as the guardian of basketball tradition, protecting the integrity of the selection process from commercial influence. But in doing so, she placed herself in direct opposition to the financial interests of everyone invested in women's basketball's success. That opposition was about to become very personal, because when the cameras pointed at Reeve and reporters started asking tough questions, her answers would make everything worse. Words matter. Especially when millions of people are watching and waiting for an explanation. Coach Cheryl Reeve had opportunities. Multiple chances to calm the storm, acknowledge the concerns, strike a tone that unified rather than divided. She could have praised Clark's talent while explaining the selection rationale. She could have expressed excitement about her Olympic future. She could have recognized the legitimate frustration of fans who felt blindsided. Instead, she chose a different path. The first comments came during pre-Olympic media sessions. When reporters inevitably asked about Clark's exclusion, Reeve's body language shifted. Her responses carried an edge that felt deliberate. She wasn't just defending a decision. She was drawing a line in the sand. Her emphasis on players earning their place through experience felt pointed. Her references to fans who don't fully understand the evaluation process seemed dismissive. The suggestion that media attention shouldn't influence roster construction came across as a rebuke to everyone who thought Clark's impact mattered. But one comment in particular ignited the firestorm that followed. When pressed about the unprecedented viewership Clark generated, Reeve reportedly responded that the Olympic team isn't a popularity contest. Those words spread across social media within minutes. Fans who were already frustrated now felt openly insulted. The implications seemed clear. Their viewership didn't matter. Their ticket purchases didn't matter. Their unprecedented support for women's basketball was irrelevant because the gatekeepers had spoken. The reaction was explosive. Comment sections filled with accusations of elitism. Hashtags demanding accountability started trending. Former players who had stayed neutral began weighing in. The story jumped from sports media to mainstream news coverage, but Reeve didn't retreat. If anything, she seemed to lean further into the confrontation. Subsequent interviews reinforced the same themes. Basketball decisions should be made by basketball people. Experience and defensive capabilities determined roster spots. The selection committee had evaluated every candidate thoroughly, and their judgment was final. None of these statements addressed the actual concerns being raised. Fans weren't arguing that Clark should make the team because she was popular. They were arguing that her exclusion represented a missed opportunity of historic proportions. They were questioning whether leadership understood the moment women's basketball was experiencing. The disconnect between what Reeve was saying and what fans were asking created a spiral of escalating frustration. Then came the comments about the new audience. According to multiple reports, Reeve made remarks during the Olympic period that distinguished between longtime supporters of women's basketball and recent arrivals. The suggestion was that newer fans, many of whom discovered the sport through Clark's games, didn't fully appreciate the history or the players who built the foundation. Whether intentional or not, these comments felt like gatekeeping. They created an impression that certain fans were more legitimate than others. That supporting Caitlin Clark somehow meant disrespecting the veterans. That enthusiasm for the sport's explosive growth was actually evidence of ignorance about its past. This framing was strategically disastrous. The entire value proposition NBC had just paid billions for depended on converting new fans into dedicated followers. The league's financial future required those recent arrivals to keep watching, keep buying merchandise, keep filling arenas. Alienating them wasn't just bad optics. It was potentially devastating to the business model. Sources suggest that WNBA executives grew increasingly uncomfortable as Reeve's comments continued making headlines. The league had spent years trying to expand its audience. Marketing campaigns emphasized accessibility and welcoming new fans. And now, the coach of the Olympic team was essentially telling those fans they didn't belong. The damage extended beyond public relations. Sponsor conversations reportedly grew more difficult. Brands that had signed deals expecting positive associations with women's basketball's growth now found themselves adjacent to controversy. Social media campaigns promoting the league were flooded with negative responses referencing Reeve's comments. What made the situation worse was the absence of any course correction. Reeve continued defending her positions without acknowledging the legitimate frustrations being expressed. There was no attempt at bridge building, no recognition that perhaps the tone had been problematic, just continued insistence that the selection process was above reproach. The stubbornness might have reflected genuine conviction. Maybe Reeve truly believed that basketball decisions should remain completely isolated from commercial considerations. Maybe she saw herself as protecting the integrity of the sport against forces that threatened to corrupt it. But convictions don't matter when they're costing your organization billions of dollars in potential growth. Principles ring hollow when they're expressed through dismissiveness toward the people funding the league's future. The comments revealed something that many had suspected, but few had confirmed. This wasn't just about roster evaluation criteria. There was an element of institutional resistance at play, a determination to remind everyone that new stars and new fans didn't automatically earn respect. That hierarchy existed for a reason. That message might have played well in certain circles, among veterans who felt overlooked, among traditionalists who worried about the sport losing its identity, among insiders who viewed the Clark phenomenon as more hype than substance. But to everyone else, to the sponsors and networks and millions of fans driving unprecedented growth, the message sounded like something far more troubling. It sounded like leadership that didn't want the sport to succeed on terms they couldn't control. And that perception was about to get reinforced by what leaked from inside the Olympic camp itself. What happens inside locker rooms typically stays there. Athletes and coaches understand that internal conversations must remain private. Team chemistry depends on trust. Disagreements get resolved away from public scrutiny. Everyone protects the sanctity of closed-door discussions. Except when they don't. Reports began emerging from sources connected to Team USA's Olympic delegation that painted a troubling picture of the internal atmosphere. These weren't official statements. They were whispers that made their way to reporters, social media accounts, and eventually mainstream coverage. According to these reports, there were conversations during team meetings that went beyond basketball analysis. Comments allegedly dismissing Clark's fan base as bandwagon supporters who would disappear once the novelty faded. Jokes reportedly made about the media coverage being overblown. An atmosphere where skepticism toward Clark's impact wasn't just tolerated, but seemingly encouraged from leadership. These reports remain unverified. Sources speaking anonymously can have their own agendas. The full context of any alleged comments is impossible to know from outside. It's important to treat this information as what it is, claims that have been made, not proven facts. But the claims themselves caused massive damage regardless of their accuracy. The perception that Team USA's leadership had created an environment hostile to Clark and her supporters reinforced every criticism that had been building since the roster announcement. It transformed the narrative from a questionable decision into something that looked personal, calculated, intentional. One alleged quote gained particular traction. A source claimed that a staff member made a comment suggesting Clark would get her turn after she learned some respect. The implication being that the exclusion wasn't about basketball readiness at all. It was about sending a message, establishing hierarchy, reminding a rookie that talent and popularity didn't automatically command deference. Whether this comment was actually made, or whether it's been exaggerated or misremembered, became almost irrelevant. It captured what millions of fans already believed was happening, and that belief shaped the public response. Meanwhile, corporate partners were having very different conversations. When companies invest millions in sports sponsorships, they expect positive associations. Feel-good stories about athletes overcoming obstacles. Inspiring moments that make consumers connect emotionally with brands. Growth narratives that suggest the investment will appreciate over time. What they don't expect is controversy, division, headlines about gatekeeping and fan alienation. Sources report that representatives from multiple major WNBA sponsors requested meetings with league leadership in the weeks following the Olympic roster controversy. The agenda wasn't complicated. They wanted to understand what was happening and how the league planned to address it. These conversations were reportedly uncomfortable. Sponsors weren't making threats exactly, but they were expressing concerns in ways that demanded attention. Questions about whether leadership understood the growth opportunity. Inquiries about how the league planned to repair relationships with alienated fans. Observations that social media sentiment had turned sharply negative. The league's response was characteristically corporate. Statements emphasizing respect for the selection process. Commitments to supporting all players. Forward-looking language about exciting opportunities ahead. Nothing that acknowledged any problem or suggested any change. Sponsors reportedly found this unsatisfying. They weren't looking for admissions of wrongdoing. They were looking for evidence that leadership understood the situation and had a plan to manage it. Generic public relations language didn't provide that evidence. More interesting was what sponsors did publicly. Some brands released content during the Olympic period that featured Caitlin Clark prominently. Not Team USA players, not the roster that had been selected. Clark specifically. It was a subtle but unmistakable message about where they believed the value resided. One major sponsor posted social media content celebrating women's basketball while specifically highlighting Clark's achievements. The timing couldn't have been coincidental. Companies don't make those content decisions by accident. The sponsor rebellion, if it could be called that, was quiet but meaningful. It demonstrated that the people writing checks understood something that leadership apparently didn't. The future of women's basketball wasn't about protecting hierarchies or teaching rookies their place. It was about maximizing the once-in-a-generation opportunity that Caitlin Clark represented. Within the WNBA itself, the fallout created fractures that may take years to heal. Players who supported the Olympic roster selection found themselves defending positions that were becoming harder to justify. Players sympathetic to Clark faced pressure to stay silent. The locker room dynamics across the league reportedly grew complicated as the controversy refused to fade. The silence from the league office was perhaps most telling. WNBA executives who should have been celebrating the NBC deal instead found themselves managing a crisis they hadn't anticipated. Every comment from Coach Reeve required monitoring. Every leaked report demanded response consideration. Every sponsor conversation added another item to already overwhelming agendas. The organization that should have been focused on building momentum from its biggest financial win ever was instead playing defense against self-inflicted wounds. And through it all, the person at the center of the controversy said almost nothing. Caitlin Clark continued playing basketball. She continued performing at levels that justified every dollar NBC had committed. She continued filling arenas and generating viewership and creating moments that reminded everyone why this entire situation was so absurd. Her response wasn't verbal. It was statistical. It was visual. It was undeniable in ways that no press release could match. But Coach Reeve wasn't done making things worse. Because instead of learning from the backlash, she was preparing to double down. When you find yourself in a difficult position, sometimes the smartest move is acknowledging complexity. Recognizing that reasonable people can disagree. Offering olive branches that create space for reconciliation. These are basic leadership principles that most people learn through experience. Coach Cheryl Reeve apparently decided on a different approach. Following Team USA's gold medal victory in Paris, Reeve had a perfect opportunity to reset the narrative. She could have celebrated the team's success while graciously acknowledging that many talented players deserved consideration. She could have praised Clark's abilities while explaining that future opportunities would come. She could have extended respect to the fans who felt disappointed while thanking them for their passion. Instead, she chose defiance. In post-Olympic interviews, Reeve leaned heavily on the results. The team won gold. The mission was accomplished. What more needed to be said? The validation of victory seemed to confirm that her roster decisions were correct. Anyone who disagreed was simply wrong. One particular exchange captured the tone perfectly. When a reporter asked whether the controversy had given her pause about the selection process, Reeve's response was dismissive. "We won, didn't we?" The implication was clear. Success justified everything. Results ended the debate. But this framing missed the entire point of the criticism. Nobody was seriously arguing that Team USA couldn't win without Caitlin Clark. The roster was loaded with incredible talent. Multiple MVPs. Championship veterans. Players who had proven themselves on international stages repeatedly. Of course they could win gold. That was never in question. The criticism was about opportunity cost. About what could have been gained beyond the medal. About exposing the sport's biggest star to billions of viewers who might have become dedicated fans. About maximizing the moment rather than simply surviving it. Reeve's victory lap felt tone-deaf because she was celebrating answering a question nobody was asking. Yes, the team was capable of winning, but capability wasn't the concern. Vision was the concern, and her response suggested she either didn't understand that distinction or didn't care. Then came the comment that made corporate partners genuinely nervous. When asked specifically about the NBC deal and whether commercial considerations should influence roster decisions, Reeve's response was revealing. She stated that she doesn't make decisions based on television contracts. She makes decisions based on what gives the team the best chance to win basketball games. On the surface, this sounds principled, admirable even. A coach focused purely on competition, immune to outside pressures, dedicated solely to athletic excellence. But consider how this statement landed with the network that had just committed billions of dollars. NBC made that investment based on assumptions about how the league would develop and promote its most valuable properties. They expected partnership, collaboration, mutual interest in maximizing the return on their historic commitment. What they heard instead was a prominent leadership figure publicly dismissing the relevance of their investment. It's one thing to prioritize basketball considerations. Every coach does that to some degree. But stating explicitly that television contracts don't factor into decisions at all, when those contracts fund the entire operation, suggested a fundamental disconnect from reality. Professional sports don't exist in a vacuum. They exist within an ecosystem of broadcasters, sponsors, and fans whose financial support makes everything possible. Acknowledging that ecosystem isn't corruption. It's basic institutional awareness. Reeve's comments suggested she viewed commercial success as separate from her responsibilities, possibly even beneath her concern. She was a basketball coach. Business considerations belonged to other people. This perspective might have been defensible in a different era. When women's basketball struggled for any attention at all, when every game was a fight for survival, when commercial considerations were almost irrelevant because there wasn't much commerce to consider. But that era was over. The NBC deal had changed everything. Women's basketball was now a billion-dollar property with billion-dollar expectations. Leadership needed to operate accordingly. By publicly distancing herself from commercial awareness, Reeve positioned herself in opposition to the interests of everyone who had just invested in the sport's future. She became a symbol of something concerning, a leader more interested in maintaining control than in maximizing success. The aftermath of these comments was predictable. More sponsor conversations, more uncomfortable questions for league executives, more fuel for fans who believed leadership was fundamentally misaligned with the moment. And still, Reeve didn't back down. Each subsequent interview reinforced the same themes: experience, evaluation criteria, respect for the process, no acknowledgement that perhaps the tone had been problematic, no recognition that millions of fans deserving better than dismissiveness. The stubbornness might have come from conviction, or from pride, or from a miscalculation about how the situation would resolve. Whatever the motivation, the effect was clear. Every comment deepened the divide. Every defensive statement confirmed what critics believed. Every opportunity for reconciliation was rejected in favor of continued defiance. Coach Reeve had decided that she was right, that the fans were wrong, and that eventually everyone would recognize this truth and move on. It was a bet that required the public to forget, to lose interest, to find something new to argue about, but the public wasn't forgetting. Because the person at the center of all this controversy kept reminding them why it mattered. Every game, every highlight, every sold-out arena. The revolution was happening whether Reeve endorsed it or not. And the only question remaining was which side of history she would find herself on when the dust finally settled. Every transformation has a tipping point. A moment when the old order realizes its grip is slipping and the new reality becomes impossible to deny. For women's basketball, that moment has arrived. What started as a roster controversy has revealed something far more significant. The structures and assumptions that governed this sport for decades are being challenged in ways that nobody anticipated. The gatekeepers who controlled access and opportunity are discovering that the gates themselves have become irrelevant. Caitlin Clark didn't need permission to transform women's basketball. She just did it. Every three-pointer from 30 feet. Every behind-the-back pass that generated millions of social media views. Every arena that sold out hours after tickets became available. Every rating that shattered previous records. She built the case for her importance through actions that no selection committee could dismiss. And here's what the old guard failed to understand. The snub didn't diminish her. It amplified her. The controversy turned casual supporters into passionate defenders. It converted people who liked watching her play into people who felt personally invested in her success. It created a narrative that extended far beyond basketball. David against Goliath. Innovation against tradition. The future against the past. When Clark returned to WNBA competition after the Olympic break, the response was overwhelming. Attendance records continued falling. Viewership numbers remained at historic levels. Corporate sponsors doubled down on their association with her brand. Everything the critics predicted would happen once the novelty wore off simply didn't happen. The phenomenon proved durable, sustainable, real. Meanwhile, the people who orchestrated the snub found themselves answering increasingly uncomfortable questions. What exactly had been accomplished? The Olympic gold medal was nice, but gold medals happen regularly. The opportunity to introduce a generational star to billions of global viewers happens once, and that opportunity was gone forever. The math didn't lie. NBC's projections about Clark's value were being validated in real time. Every metric they had used to justify their investment was trending in the right direction. The billions they committed suddenly looked like a bargain, and the decision to exclude Clark from the Olympics looked more short-sighted with every passing week. Inside the league, conversations about leadership began shifting. The people making decisions about women's basketball's future were being evaluated through a new lens. Did they understand the moment? Did they recognize what was possible? Or were they so committed to protecting the past that they couldn't see the opportunity in front of them? Coach Reeve's position, once unassailable, now carried questions. Her coaching credentials remained impeccable. Her track record of success was undeniable. But success in the old paradigm doesn't guarantee relevance in the new one. And the new paradigm was being defined by someone she had tried to keep on the sidelines. The sponsors noticed the shift. Brands that had hesitated to fully embrace women's basketball started increasing their investments. They saw a sport on the verge of breaking through to mainstream relevance. They saw a star who could anchor marketing campaigns for years. They saw an audience that was young, engaged, and growing rapidly. The networks noticed too. Beyond NBC, other media companies started paying closer attention to women's basketball content. Streaming platforms explored exclusive deals. Digital media outlets increased their coverage. The sport was becoming a legitimate competitor for audience attention in ways it never had been before. Most importantly, the fans noticed. The millions of people who had discovered women's basketball through Caitlin Clark weren't going anywhere. They were becoming more committed, not less. They were bringing friends and family to games. They were purchasing merchandise. They were creating content and building communities around their shared enthusiasm. This wasn't a temporary surge that would fade once the novelty expired. This was a fundamental expansion of the audience base, a permanent shift in who cared about women's basketball and how much they cared. The old guard could dismiss these fans as bandwagoners who didn't understand the game. But those dismissals changed nothing. The fans were still there, still watching, still spending money, still driving the growth that funded everyone's salaries. Eventually, reality has a way of forcing recognition. The people who resisted the change would either adapt or find themselves marginalized. The institutions that prioritized hierarchy over opportunity would either evolve or become irrelevant. The gatekeepers who tried to control the narrative would either accept their diminished influence or exhaust themselves fighting the inevitable. This is what transformation looks like. It's messy, it's contentious, it creates winners and losers, it forces people to choose sides, and it doesn't wait for permission from the people it's displacing. Caitlin Clark didn't ask the old guard to embrace her. She didn't need their validation. She had something more powerful than their approval. She had the audience. She had the numbers. She had the billions of dollars that proved her value beyond any argument. She had the future. And the future doesn't negotiate with the past. It simply arrives whether the past is ready or not. The billion-dollar check was written. The truth was exposed. The revolution wasn't coming anymore. It was already here. So where does this leave us? A sport transformed by one player's impact. A billion-dollar investment that validated what fans already knew. A coaching decision that exposed the gap between tradition and opportunity. A controversy that revealed who truly understood the moment and who was desperately trying to control it. Caitlin Clark will play in future Olympics. The numbers guarantee it. The money demands it. The audience expects nothing less. Whatever happened in Paris was a delay, not a destination. But the real story isn't about one roster or one tournament. It's about what women's basketball becomes from here. Whether leadership learns from this moment or repeats the same mistakes. Whether the sport capitalizes on its unprecedented opportunity or squanders it protecting egos. The fans have made their position clear. The sponsors have placed their bets. The networks have committed their billions. Everyone who matters has chosen to invest in the future Caitlin Clark represents. The only people still fighting that future are the ones who feel threatened by it. History will remember this moment. It will remember the decision that was made. It will remember the comments that followed. And it will remember who stood in the way of progress when progress was the only option that made sense. The truth has been exposed. The question now is what comes next.